we had actually two official presentations today from people who were professional and involved in the planning of the city and you know, kind of relating to certain agenda. And then we had two academic, I would say, but also professional lectures. And I think that one could probably learn quite a bit from a diversity of approaches. But also maybe one question that I would pose is that perhaps we can discuss the kind of complexity of the city has, and it could be, and that perhaps some of the institutions work in a very kind of simple and singular way. One of the purposes we have of this whole Stockholm on the Move project is to sort of integrate all many different aspects of the urban development without having to solve all the problems, but just to really kind of grasp that there are issues that you cannot solve alone. And then if you were to try to solve them, that you need to kind of help from many different parties. And there were a few questions, very interesting one, several really. One that had to do what happened since Jane Jacobs. Maybe that could be a really interesting topic to talk about. A lot happened, I think, since Jane Jacobs. But then what happened to global economy, global politics? We can talk about that as well. And there was another question. What was the last question here? Somebody else said. I think it was something about, they had to do with the modes production, but also with the deregulation of the city. So all of our practices are somehow adopted to these circumstances, and we are adjusting ourselves to be able to address the urban problems because they are transforming, and the tools and the ways of addressing urban problems are transforming as well. So maybe, I suggest maybe we start talking about the kind of urban complexity and how do we relate this kind of idea of urban mobility and that changing in a way, but also the relations between the actors and the stakeholders, the communication. Maybe one can talk about from your own experiences in your own city, for example, in Zurich. And maybe you can talk about Aalborg, or you can choose another city that you find interesting.
So maybe I can tell quickly because I was showing the station area now in Zurich. We started with that 2003. In 2004, we got also invited for a competition in Vienna. The same issue, kind of the joining of South and East Station, and to kind of develop the central station of Vienna. But there was completely different, let's say the collaboration between the different parties, because the city was planning, let's say, certain tram lines, not at all discussing with the railway authorities, and not planning any stop at the station. And if this is not, I was kind of getting in and said, hey, what are you doing here? Because this is completely senseless. But if this kind of parties, and these were now only two, and if the different stakeholders and the different parties don't collaborate, we cannot deal with this kind of complexities of city development, because you need to have all the stakeholders around the table, and also a certain kind of idea of compromising. We're talking very often that we kind of let's say the coordinator, or let's say the orchestrator of these different parties, because you have to deal with all of them and you have to find a way to integrate this in a plan. And if they are not talking to you, you kind of, once in a while, I also once said, we just work for the paper, for the bin. If you don't address, let's say, the problems, you need to, let's say, your kind of points and your parameters. And I think it's a complex issue, but you can get this, you cannot plan this top down. I had a bit today the feeling that the planning, let's say the infrastructure department, the kind of public transportation is kind of planned a little bit too much top down. So you, because she was saying that there's not enough mass for sub-centers, let's say in the outskirts. I don't think so. It's a question of kind of, because urban planning and transportation and mobility goes all the time together. And you cannot blend one without the other, and the other way around. And I think the Stockholm region is dense enough, let's say, to supply a certain kind of circular. Let's say what I did not mention is you have I only showed, let's say, the tram line network and the metro network of Zurich, but there is a kind of like a spider web, a kind of completely concentric, let's say, bus net on top of that. So each spot is kind of, each lane of tram or metro is then again linked with a certain concept, you get everywhere. And this kind of overlay of different layers you need in a city like that, especially on the size of Stockholm.
Do you want me to dip in? Well, I'm not going to talk much about Aalborg, but I think this notion of complexity and openness. I think actually what I'm thinking about when I'm listening to the presentations of these planners and the documents and all of that is, of course, well, maybe a little bit like Jane Jacobs. She once wrote a little text saying what's the kind of problem a city is. So what is actually on our hands here? It's such a complicated thing, right? A city, and planning for cities are really, really complex issues. So I think we can quite easily sort of agree on that no profession can do it on its own, right? And so when one profession draws up a plan, it's small wonder that it's sort of being put down by other professions and so forth. I was mentioning that I've been running this urban design studio where we work with the metro in Copenhagen, and we've been looking at various metros in various cities. One of my favorite quotes for sort of the curriculum is a quote from Norman Foster, who argues that think of what he likes about designing metros is the fact that people experience the cities continuously, right? So they don't sort of look at or experience the city as okay, now I'm in the mayor's office area, now I'm doing economic transactions, so now I'm in the economy, and now I'm out in the transport planner's domain and so forth. And I think we were interviewing an architect in a company that had dealt with an airport station in Copenhagen, which is a big sort of commute transport hub, and he couldn't understand why we were interested in the metro, because clearly public space was on the surface, and the metro was the metro company's domain. This was the municipal's domain, and I was treasuring that comment so much, because when we went back with the students, I said, did you notice, how his worldview, in all practical terms, was shaped completely by, the jurisdiction of his area, which is okay. That's fair, but it's not the way you live in the city. That's not the way it works. So I think if you're looking from the bottom up, it makes absolutely no sense to do big, nice plans that don't take account of how people experience places, right? And I think if you're dealing with a region on the size of Stockholm, I think, and you were sort of hinting at sort of needle pins and very specific concrete spatial experiments. I think those are much more interesting than grand plans and grand designs supposedly working for 50 years. Nobody knows what 50 years look like. But if you have an idea for testing, like for instance, I know I'm a geek for Wi-Fi and stuff like that, but testing that out in transit spaces or playing with, public art and stuff like that, try that out in various zones and see what that can work. I think that's much more interesting than these shelf-made plans that will probably be only interesting for your own sort of professional vanity. But that was tough, wasn't it?
Yeah. Maybe there are some questions from you here as well. Okay.
No.
No, I was, yeah.
It's someone away.
Coming from Chicago, I think one of the most prevalent problems is the lack of communication between planning authorities and the stakeholders, so to speak. There is almost no connect between their goals. Like the stakeholders only think about making money, like the gentleman from Australia said earlier, and it's a problem. Like they don't think about the greater good, so to speak. They don't think about the master plan in any way, really. And I see a huge difference here in Stockholm, but there still has to be like a driving force behind that need to connect. And I need to know like where that comes from looking forward, I guess.
Well, is it a question?
There's a huge difference in attitude, and I just kind of wondered like what the history of that development was here versus in America. So if you
Well, it's not an easy question. It's a big, long back, I guess, in history. But again, I'll say what I think. That maybe I think states has developed somewhat different than Europe. I think States is quite a lot developed, but it's kind of big, fast development during the beginning or the end of 19th century in this industrialization and so on. So it was quite a lot developed on a very kind of efficient principles where economy and you know, quickness, speed, profit, and it's not necessarily all bad. You have really amazing cities coming out, including Chicago. So it was like a test ground of new paradigms, but then runs for a while. And there is challenges that come up in a city. And those challenges, so the profession perhaps, again, this is my own, well, not my own idea, but I would say this is my perspective, is that you need to develop and you have to change and transform your professional methods and also your attitude, and you have to develop the way you work. And that's where the kind of excitement comes in from our side. So maybe that hasn't evolved enough. So again, I don't know exactly about Chicago. I know a little bit more about New York. In New York City, you have kind of like what you were showing in Zurich. There is a developed regional, there is a sort of zoning system, urban regulations that has been, instead of designing a city, they have developed a kind of set of principles that have to be followed, and they are put into the law. So the law was one method. So if you follow the law, you don't necessarily have to communicate with everybody. But now, today, kind of a change of paradigm, there is, as you saw, there are things that are not implemented in the law. Or there is no binding document that tells somebody that they have to follow the plan. It's a long story why this happened. I guess we can talk about it maybe. But so now we have, it's also the changing of the planning discipline that, again, we also talked about it, its own deficiencies and lack of knowledge because of the challenges have evolved. This almost disappeared or is forced to transform. So there are two things running parallel. There's nothing binding, and the planning profession has become weaker in the face of new challenges. It needs help from other forces. And in some places, in some cities, people or professionals or the government has not evolved enough, perhaps, or they have not really learned from the situation and adopted. And in some cases, they're trying to do that. So the whole process, I think, of this sort of called urban governance, which we have today, is a kind of a process of adaptation. And I think this sort of collaboration and discussions between actors is a sort of adaptation to the economic and social circumstances. I don't know if I answered right well, but it's a long story.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. Like, we work with a system that hasn't failed us yet, and now it's starting to not necessarily fail us, but we need to adapt. It's not happening fast.
Exactly. The profession is changing. It needs to change.
Do you have any comments?
Well, I was just saying, I mean, it's quite evident that there are much more focus on process and communication and negotiation skills, and this notion from government to governance, and the sort of whole profession seems to be sort of changing in a certain way. But even, I think, like I said, I wouldn't talk about Aalborg, but let me talk a little bit about Aalborg then. That's, you know, a well-dressed, social democratic welfare state thing in the northern part of Denmark, right? So you would expect that, you know, the state would roll out a nice plan and everybody would walk around being sort of well planned. But actually, for more than 10 years, and well, maybe even 20, I think that it would be fair to describe the planners' culture in the planning department as one being predominantly stakeholder-led, meaning that they would, I mean, like in Sweden, then the municipal level is the binding legal framework, right? And so if a stakeholder or a property owner has a good idea, he makes up a drawing or makes up a local plan, and the only thing it misses is the municipal stamp, right? And he goes up and sort of so I think this notion of the public good as in this kind of grand sort of state design, I think that's, as you zoom in, it cracks up a little bit, and I think it's equal to many other places that, you know, city governments are bidding for funds. They want big players to settle there, not in the neighborhood, county or community, because of tax and all of that. So I think it is not as well sort of carefully planned as it might look. At least.
Yeah, I think so too, and it's changing very often. For instance, just coming from Helsinki, and let's say they had a really very good quality in planning and also, let's say, quality in architecture, and at the moment they have an urban planning department and they define all this kind of plans, so to say, but the power to develop is in the hands of several developers, and they are, let's say, next to that also builders. So they dictate, let's say, what happens. And I think this is all the time, this equilibrium between, let's say, planning, also different kind of planning levels, but also really the economic side, the stakeholders. Say how much power has which kind of part in who is this possible to regulate, let's say. And this change really kind of, there are really periods changing like that. And let's say, as far as I don't know Chicago, only can, but it also works, you know, kind of there is a certain regulation, and this kind of systems regulate somehow, and if it's really going wrong, then there is a certain kind of, let's say, reaction again on that. So it's not, and for sure, let's say, the states have a completely different development than Europe. Let's say we were discussing earlier how many different cultures we have within this kind of quite small, let's say, area. So you just cannot compare, and what I really learned and what I also find really challenging is each city where I till now worked in is completely different in respect to planning issues and regulations, and how you cannot just transform one, let's say, idea of ideology or kind of approach to the next. Because people live differently, they like to, they have completely different lifestyle, and they also, let's say, everything is also kind of based on the cultural, let's say, culture and collective consciousness, let's say, people have, and how they kind of move in a city and how they kind of deal with the city, and also their landscape. We were just discussing in Tampere an issue about density, and they like to densify the city. But Finnish people really like to live on the countryside. Sorry, you cannot force them and push them into the city, so you have to deal with this kind of aspects, how they, and maybe kind of start a long-term transformation, but not kind of plan this from top down. They just won't accept.
Maybe I could just add to that. I mean, I think that taps very nicely into this notion that you actually don't have a sort of homogeneous singular public good, right? I think you have multiple publics voicing in various ways, right? And actually, from my experience in the US, doing research on sort of civil society planning initiatives, there's actually a completely different sort of much more aggressive and much more vocal way of thinking about articulating ideas and wishes, whereas at least in Denmark, a lot of people would expect the planners to deal with that public good, but as soon as it sort of crosses their interest, you know, it's not public good anymore, and it sort of cracks up, and it shows the multiple interests that are actually around. So I think you know, it might look as if everything is neat and ordered, but I think actually we could look the other way around and see for interesting ways that civil society groups actually are really, really vocal and very good at organizing things in a much more different way. Maybe because the state had a different sort of scale or whatever, I don't know. There's probably a lot of reasons for that.